It's a great honor to introduce Marianne Coninsx. Her Excellency is the Ambassador of the European Union to Canada. She began her posting as the EU's top diplomat in Canada in September 2013 after serving 4 years as an ambassador of the EU to Mexico. Ambassador Coninsx has been an official of the EU since 1984, and she started her career in the European Commission at the Legal Service, and indeed has law degrees from, she studied law at Ghent University in Belgium and did postgraduate studies specializing in international law and European law, respectively, at Cambridge University and at the European University Center in Nancy, France. Over 12 consecutive years, in her career at the European Commission, she was staff member in the cabinets of three commissioners dealing respectively with external relations and external trade, internal market and relations with the European Parliament, and development policy. Ambassador Coninsx has extensive experience dealing with multilateral issues, having served as Minister Counselor at the EU delegation in New York and thereafter in Geneva. And prior to her posting in Mexico, she worked at the External Relations Department at headquarters, overseeing relations between the EU and Latin America. We're delighted to have you join us today, Your Excellency. We've had a very full discussion this morning on this very interesting question of investor-state arbitration between developed democracies. This is clearly an interesting issue between Europe and its member states and North America, and it's a subject that interests countries around the world. So without more, I turn it to you. Merci.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. I would particularly like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to address to this audience a very, very important issue, which is very high on the agenda these days within the European Union. And I could not participate myself to your discussions, but I heard they were very interesting, and I was very impressed by your program of today, the broad scope of the discussions, and also the variety of experience and the persons participating in this investor-state arbitration discussion. As I said, the debate about investor-to-state arbitration, particularly in Europe, is very recent. It not always has been concerned with real life experience but real content of the ISDS clauses in treaties, but a lot has been driven also by more emotional than factual arguments, and I will give you in the course of my statement some of these examples. But despite this, a substantial debate on the investor-to-state arbitration is now taking place within the European Union, and it's taking place because we have very, very important trade negotiations which are ongoing. You probably all know that we have concluded the negotiations with CETA, but there is important trade negotiations going on with the US, and these discussions on the investor-to-state arbitration have an impact on these negotiations. I will give you some examples about it. Just maybe as a kind of preliminary information, the trade dossier for the European Union is an exclusive competence of the European Union, which means that the European Commission undertakes the trade negotiations exclusively, but of course it's done on the basis of a mandate, and that mandate is given and agreed upon by 28 member states, and during the negotiations itself there are constantly also discussions with our member states, and finally when the negotiations are ended, we also will need the agreement of our member states. But why does all this discussion on investor-to-state arbitration is so important? Well, it all boils down to the importance of trade itself. For the European Union, trade is one of the top priorities in its policy, Trade itself over the last years, trades in goods and services has been increased 7% per year. The trade in goods increased fourfold in these 30 years in volume. World trade has been growing nearly twice as fast as the world production for a number of decades. And why do we have this increase of trade, which is an engine for us for growth and for creating jobs? Trade has been increased and expanded thanks to, I would say, a lot of work which has been done to liberalize trade in the framework of the multilateral framework, the WTO, but I would say very importantly also thanks to the bilateral and regional trade agreements, which have led to a substantial reduction in trade barriers, and the number of trade agreements has been growing worldwide. Also, if we look at the trade agreements that the European Union has been negotiating and is concluding more recently, they have gone from a very traditional free trade agreement, more focusing on elimination of tariffs and barriers. They have become more profound and more comprehensive. And today we speak about new generation agreements, which goes much beyond removal of tariffs and non-tariff obstacles, but also address, for example, issues like intellectual property, procurement, investment protection, services, regulatory cooperation, and much more. These new generation agreements we have not only concluded or are negotiating with, they are not only the big agreements like the CETA agreement with Canada or the TTIP with the US, but equally we are applying this new generation trade agreements with smaller countries, if I can say so, like the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and the Canada-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. And it is our experience, even with the classical free trade agreements as with the new ones, that they lead to an increase of trade, a substantive increase of trade. I had seen it in the case when I was in Mexico, which was one of our oldest free trade agreements in the Americas, where trade had expanded with a classical free trade agreement enormously over the last years. But take, for example, the most recent Canada-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, which was entered into force in 2011. In the first year already, our trade has increased with 35%. So it is really something which is an important vehicle. And it's not always easy to get a conclusion or the end of negotiations on these trade agreements. And particularly, as I said, for the EU, these free trade agreements are very important. And why? Because free trade overall is important. And I don't have to say this here because the US, Canada, and the EU always has been very big defenders of free trade. But the European Union is a major trade power in the world. We are the biggest exporter and the biggest importer in the world. We have the biggest we are the biggest investors in the world, also counting on inbound and outbound investments. We are the first trading partner for 80 countries worldwide. By comparison, the US is the top trading partner for a little over 20 countries worldwide. At the moment, the EU trade FTAs, free trade agreements, covers 50% of our trade with the world. When we will succeed in negotiations and conclusions with the US, then 75% of our trade will be covered by free trade agreements. So I would say trade and investment are crucial for us and are crucial for European growth and jobs. But a condition to have this kind of increase and expansion of trade and investment is to have a very stable and sound and predictable environment to do that, to have these investments. And I'm sure that this has been said many times this morning, that for investors it's very important that investment barriers are dismantled and that investments to be protected, and therefore some form of dispute settlement mechanism is crucial. The TTIP negotiations of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership agreement between the EU and the US, the negotiations started some time ago. And I would say that the most controversial, these are extremely difficult negotiations because, as with the case with Canada, we do not have anymore a lot of tariffs which has to be dismantled. The biggest element are the non-trade barriers and also other very complicated issues which are to be addressed. But the most controversial issue in these trade negotiations with the US has been the ISDS clause. It has not only, I would say, be difficult in the negotiations itself, but particularly, and it might have been mentioned here this morning also, it led even to manifestations within certain countries, member states of the European Union, against the agreement. So there is a kind of, I would say, fundamental and widespread lack of trust in the public regarding the fairness and the impartiality of this ISDS system within the TTIP. And I said in the beginning, it's not always based on rationale, on sometimes also emotional feelings which come into place. I would say that the classical example of investment protection that it's being used in the case of expropriations is not anymore a typical case which could happen with trade or agreements with the US, Canada, or the European Union. But what has caused most of the problems within the European Union is a fear, a risk that maybe these clauses or this protection might be used to serve other interests and maybe to deviate of certain rules that we have, regulations regarding health and environment regulations, where we have extremely high standards within the European Union. I'm not saying it's justified, it's just this feeling and fear and a lack of trust which exists. Also, some have argued against the ISDS system that is a system of private justice. So this whole controversy on the ISDS has affected very much the public acceptance of the negotiations itself with the US. And we even are feeling a kind of spillover of this negative discussion on the agreement with Canada, the CETA agreement. Although the situation is different, EU-Canada negotiations, because the negotiations are closed, are finished, and the ISDS clause, which is already a modern version, what we have in the CETA agreement, never has caused any difficulties in our negotiations with Canada, nor with dealing with it with our member states of the European or with the European Parliament. So I just want to say that this investment protection is a very important element of our European Union investment policy, where also the European Union, since our most recent treaty, has also got an exclusive competence to negotiate investment protection agreements, that this has become an important element. And because there has been this resistance, mistrust, and big discussions going on, the European Commission on the 16th of September, so very recently, has submitted a new proposal for a new investment court system for the TTIP, which I will give some explanation about it, but it's a proposal of the European Commission, which is, you can have all the information about it on the internet. This new approach will have to be discussed with our member state, but also with the European Parliament, because also in the European Parliament we had very critical voices about it. And once this proposal will be accepted by our European Parliament and the member states, it will be presented to the Americans. And then we will see from where it will go on. Allow me to give some details about the new proposal. It will replace the new ISDS, the old ISDS provisions as had been proposed to the Americans, and it consists of a public investment court system, which is composed of a tribunal of first instance and an appeal tribunal. The judges will be publicly appointed. They must have very high qualifications. The court system could be comparable to other international courts and the WTO appellate body. The first tribunal of first instance would have 15 judges. The appeal tribunal would have 6 judges. The judges would be prohibited to take work as a legal counsel or any investments disputes proceedings, and would be subject to very strict ethical rules. Also, the disputes would be allocated to judges randomly, which means also that the dispute parties will not be able to choose the judges for a specific case, which is a fundamental change compared with the old system. Also, the ability of investors to take a case before the tribunal will be very precisely defined and limited to cases such as targeted discriminations on the basis of gender, race, or religion or nationality, expropriation without compensation, or denial of justice. And finally, also the right of governments to regulate would be enshrined and guaranteed in the provisions of trade and investment agreements. So this is a new approach which built on many of the elements which had been put forward during the consultations that the European Commission had been done, public consultations. And the new approach also contains elements like transparency, which means that all the hearings of these tribunals, the court, will be open, and everything will be, all the documents will be online, will be available online. Forum shopping will not be possible. One cannot look for the best courts to take your case. A clear distinction between international law and domestic law will be maintained, and multiple and parallel proceedings will be avoided. So this will be proposed in the framework of the TTIP negotiations with the US, but in parallel, the European Commission will also look at proposing a multilateral court system. So this new approach, a new proposal, will be, in the first place, be applicable for the negotiations with the US and for all ongoing or future negotiations. Which means that it means two things. That it indicates with Canada, where the negotiations are closed, that the negotiations will not be reopened. Commissioner Malmström has said this publicly at several occasions, and she repeated it in the presentation when she presented this new proposal, which does not exclude that in the legal scrubbing exercise which is being done. Legal scrubbing means simply that the negotiated text is being put in legal text, in agreement text, so that there might be some adjustments which might be done, but these adjustments, of course, will have to be discussed and with the Canadians itself, but it will be excluded, and she said it very clearly, to have the negotiations reopened. I think this is very important for us. And secondly, in case that such a new approach will be adopted, which will and might be accepted by the US, then it means that this new system will be then a kind of reference of investment resolution for future agreement, and might really set a future world standard, I would say. Again, we can only reach agreement on it provided that our partner countries with whom we are going to negotiate will reach an agreement on it, but we are quite confident that it will be possible to be done. So this is the overview I wanted to give you on the importance of trade for the European Union, the importance of the investment protection in this framework, and the most recent, it's only since the 16th of September that we have this new proposal, and I'm open for any questions in case you would have so. Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, if you don't change the investment chapter in CETA, will you not allow virtually any American company to go around the TTIP and use the CETA unreformed in a complaint against the European regulation? So there is forum shopping in that sense. Most American companies have branches in Canada.
Yeah, but I think it can only be applicable in case it's a case which concerns directly investments in the EU or investment in Canada. I mean, related to the EU CETA agreement. So they will not be able, I think, to bring the new system will not apply to the CETA. The CETA ISDS clauses are already much more modern than the existing clauses that we have, but these will have to be applied in that case, and not a new system. So I don't see the danger of foreign shopping or trying to have the new system applied where there is an agreement in the bilateral relation to have the old system.
Okay.
As a lawyer, I see it like that, but you know, lawyers can have completely different opinions.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter Mazur from Embassy News. Just to sort of follow up on that subject, clearly this is something the European Commission is interested in pushing forward in the future. If a new Canadian government were to indicate it were willing to take part in such a system, would the EU be open to negotiating bringing Canada into that system?
I think in any case, we're in election season here, huh? But the current government, who is very proud, and with reasons, to have this CETA agreement, which for us is, for Canada and for us, is the most ambitious trade agreement ever concluded. There has been an explicit wish from both sides, Canada and the EU, not to reopen anything in the agreement. And why? Because there were some of the elements in the negotiations which were extremely difficult and where concessions had to be done. And I personally think that overall, I'm now 2 years in Canada. I have a lot of discussions with business, going to the provinces, and overall the reception is extremely positive of the CETA agreement. Business is impatient, like we are, hoping to get to start the implementation of the agreement as soon as possible. But as I said, the last months of the negotiations were very difficult because there were some very sensitive issues where compromise has been reached, which means that in case one of the parties would indicate, I would like to reopen this, it's not excluded that it's a kind of Pandora box where other issues, because why to open this issue where in the negotiations with Canada, EU-Canada, there has been full agreement on the ISDS clause. So why to reopen it? But I said it's election campaign, and whoever wins the elections, there might be a wish maybe to open some of the elements. I personally don't think so, but if it comes to that, we will see. Mm-hmm. But the adjustments of the system we will have to discuss with the Canadians. That's clear. But we are already in discussion with the Canadians. It's not that they don't know about it.
Yes, Marc Lalonde. I heard you refer to prohibition of discrimination on the basis of nationality.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that Trade Commissioner Malmström used a similar language, the ability of investor in the press release of the EU to take a case before the tribunal would be precisely defined and limited to cases such as targeted discrimination on the basis of gender, race, relation, or nationality. Now, can you explain to me why in Article 3 of the draft Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, as in CETA, you have a prohibition, targeted discrimination on manifestly wrongful grounds such as gender, race, or religious belief. Mm-hmm. My experience is that where there has been discrimination, quite frequently, it was not on the basis of religion, not on the basis of race, mm-hmm. and certainly not on the basis of gender. It was on the basis of nationality. Yeah. Any reason why nationality would not be mentioned here? Because your eventual court may take a very literal interpretation and says, well, these people were states, they knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Nationality would have been an obvious thing to mention if you were going to give examples of possible discrimination. So a press release will not be good enough to satisfy your eventual judges, I'm afraid.
I don't think it's just a press release. I think if you have, and I don't have the text with me, we have the exact proposal of the European Commission of the new approach is online. And so I guess if she has said in the press release, and my statement was based on the information I got from them, yeah. I guess that in the new approach explicitly nationality is mentioned as well.
Well, I'm referring here to the Commission draft text, TTIP investment.
The new approach?
Yes.
Where is Amila? Okay. I brought my expert for all difficult questions.
I'm not a lawyer, I should add, but I do have the press release, and it specifically says nationality. So maybe it's just a question of maybe finding it in another part of the text. We can look at it bilaterally.
Oh, the press release. There's no doubt it is in the press release.
Yeah.
But a press release is not a legal text.
No,
we have here a draft text of the treaty.
That's what I'm saying. Why don't we look at it bilaterally? Because I would think if it's in the
press
press release,
it
has
would
to
be very
in
helpful. Otherwise, I just can't understand. I can't understand the proceeding that way.
We will check that. Thank you very much for that remark.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Coninsx. We really appreciated your presentation. You've added all this very new information to this conference, and we really appreciate that because clearly when you agreed, you didn't have this document yet. This was a very new addition to the story about ISDS. So appreciate you coming, speaking to us today. You're also a brave woman, standing in a room with all these ISDS
I like it.
arbitrators. So yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.